All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in tonight for this very special event with best-selling author Tony Park, who we're very pleased to be able to talk to tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people, the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So my name is Victoria. Myself and my colleague Rhiannon are hosting the event tonight from cold, invigorating Bathurst, I think Patsy described it as. So we'll be looking after the Q&A to help out with any tech issues that you may be having. You can also use this box to type in any questions that you may have for Tony tonight, or any comments or hellos. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. If you've read Tony books, what you think of them, any questions you may have for Tony, would be more than happy to see those come through. So I'd like to thank you all in advance for your patience as we work out any kinks that come along with delivering these kind of talks. It is something new for us, so we appreciate any kind of feedback you have, as we're always looking to improve these events. So any comments and feedback you have is more than welcome. So first up, I'd like to start by giving you a bit of an intro to our guest author, Tony Park. So Tony grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and he was not, in fact, born in South Africa or Zimbabwe or any of the African countries that feature in his stories. He has worn many hats, including working as a newspaper journalist in Sydney, as a press secretary for the New South Wales government, a journalist again, this time in rural England, later a public relations professional back in Sydney, and for 34 years, Tony also served in the Australian Army Reserve, finishing up as a major. So Tony and his wife have visited Africa in 1995, and you became hooked on the continent, Tony. You now visit every year. And during one of those trips, you actually wrote a manuscript published by Penn Macmillan and known as Far Horizon. Since then, Tony, you have written a total of 18 fiction novels and an additional 6 biographies with other people. So my goodness, you have been busy. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Victoria, and thanks very much to Bathurst Council for hosting this event and for embracing, what they call the new normal these days. It's something I've been trying to do to reach out to more of my friends and readers using online technology. And I have to say, if there's one positive out of this mess that the world finds itself in the moment, is I think people are making that extra effort to connect. So if people have tuned in from around Australia or the Central West or even South Africa or other areas, thank you for making the time and for reaching out and supporting us.
Wonderful. It certainly is a different kind of world that we find ourselves in. And I find that the opportunity to be able to connect like this is really good in these kind of times as well. So fantastic. And it's so good to see people tuning in from all over the country as well as overseas as well tonight. So look, we might as well dive straight into it, Tony.
Yeah.
For our attendees tonight, I've got a little bit of a book synopsis we'll start with just to get the event started. And in case that you haven't actually picked up your copy yet, because it came out this week. That's right, Tony, isn't it?
That's right, yeah, and still to come out later in South Africa in about a month's time.
In about a month's time. Fantastic. All right, so the big book synopsis. Joanne Flack is on the run, suspected of stealing a rare African plant thought to be extinct and worth millions of dollars. Sonia Kurtz is hired by the CIA to hunt down Joanne and find the link between the missing, correct me if I'm wrong, cycad?
Correct, yeah.
That's correct, brilliant. The missing cycad and a terrorist group hiding out in South Africa. Joanne is a member of the Pretoria Cycad and Firearms Appreciation Society, who take it upon themselves to track down the plant and the traitor in their midst who is willing to kill for it. Well, where to start? Look, I have to say, Tony, I love the way you've written the very start of this book. It caught my attention immediately. It was very interesting. And within less than 20 pages, the story kicks off with this bang, and we dive into the greed, the danger, and the treachery within. So I'm very glad to hear you tell us a bit more about your inspiration and your writing process and what's next for your characters. So let me start. First up, you and your wife became hooked on Africa after you visited as tourists in 1995. And that is obviously the setting you chose for your writing, including the new book, Last Survivor. Can you describe for me and for others who haven't actually been to Africa, what exactly is it about Africa that keeps you going back?
No, Victoria. It's something I've thought about many, many times. And over the years, we've been traveling there, as you mentioned, since 1995. And basically since Far Horizon came out in 2004, by that stage, we were spending literally half our lives in Africa. So about 6 months of the year there and 6 months of the year here in Australia, where I am now in Sydney. And so I think one of the things you mentioned in your question, in your preliminary there, was hooked on Africa. Sometimes people say to me, have said, do you have a love affair with Africa? And I said, no, I think it's different and stronger to that. It certainly was almost like an addiction, because we went on what was supposed to be a 3-week safari holiday to South Africa, Zimbabwe and Namibia back in 1995. And my wife and I had travelled around quite a bit around, like Aussies travel a lot. You know, we had backpacked around Europe and lived in the UK, as you mentioned. I've worked in the UK as a journalist. And we thought this was just going to be another place that we would just tick off the list. You know, we would go to these 3 countries where I knew nothing about. And I think one of the things that happened, or one of the reasons my life changed, I think, was because my wife is the one who does all the planning in our family. It's just the 2 of us. And so when we go traveling, she does all the organising and the bookings and the research and everything. And I just pretty well do as I'm told. You know, I follow along. And so when we arrived in South Africa, I was totally, literally unprepared for what was about to happen to me. I didn't even know how we were going to get around. She told me we were going to hire a car and drive ourselves around. I didn't know that you could do that. I thought, you know, you're going to go on safari and see these big dangerous animals and all these, you know, scary wildlife areas that someone else would do the driving. But I was so unprepared that I think when it hit me really hard. And like a lot of first-time travellers to the continent, it was certainly the wildlife that drew us there. We were going on a safari holiday. But very quickly, as we travelled through South Africa and Zimbabwe and Botswana, this continent hooked us. Now, I don't know whether we breathed something in or we drank something or ate something, I don't know. But it was more than the wildlife, you know. It was the landscapes that we were travelling through, which were majestic and, funnily enough, very similar to home. And what some of your readers, your customers from Bathurst might be surprised if they haven't been to Africa, is just how much of South Africa is so similar to Australia. And I mean central western New South Wales. Like, I mean, the landscapes are incredibly similar. So on one hand, you have this place that is familiar, and people very much like ourselves, like Australians, with a love of the outdoors, an affinity to the land, an interesting history, both the Indigenous history and the history of colonialism, very similar to ours in many ways, is that as well as feeling welcome and familiar, it was so different than anywhere else we'd ever been. And the stories of the people that we then met, it seemed like everyone had a story that would put Crocodile Dundee to shame. So for a person that was sort of thinking at that stage about writing, I hadn't got serious about it, there seemed to be so much to fascinate the traveller or the visitor here that it was little wonder that we got hooked. And instead of it being a once-in-a-lifetime experience, by probably the end of the first week, if not the first couple of days, we had already started planning a return trip. And indeed, we've been back every year, even snuck in a trip in January this year. Apart from a year, I went to Afghanistan with the army. So it became part of our lives. And I think hooked is the word, because like any addiction, the more we see, the more we get, the more we want. And it's very much, I'm still very much in that mode, I think, with Africa, because it's such a diverse continent with so many diverse countries and so many diverse cultures that even when you think you've seen a large chunk of the continent, you realise you barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, it would surprise me myself to learn that there is some similarities in the landscape between out Bathurst Way and South Africa. I would never have really thought about that. But there you go. So having that familiarity, I can certainly see why it would be become appealing and interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah.
For any of our attendees, if you've been to South Africa or Africa and had something similar, let me know, because it's very interesting to be able to learn that. So you don't shy away from writing Africa the way it is in terms of the corruption, the crime, and the health issues. So how do you approach writing these aspects into your books?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, these things, crime and corruption and politics and mismanagement and health issues like we're going through at the moment, and the health issues are a part of everyday life, unfortunately, in the countries I write about, with the HIV/AIDS pandemic that happened and malaria and things like this. These weigh heavily on people's minds. So on one hand, it's like Africa is no different, or South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana are no different to anywhere else in the world, but the magnitude of the problems can be greater. The issues that ordinary people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis can be far greater. So what I do in writing about these issues is I try and keep it as realistic as possible. These things are part of life, but what I want to do is kind of reflect my experience sometimes, that for the bad things I see, I most of my books, apart from the last one, another one, which are more historical, Africa in the various countries that I write about, I try to realistically reflect the impact that these things have on people's lives, and they do. Politics has a huge impact on people's lives in the countries that I write about. Sometimes in terms of life and death, and so you can't write a book set in a country like, say, Zimbabwe, for an example, and ignore the recent politics of the country. So yeah, I think the trick is in writing contemporary fiction is to try and keep it current without being dated, but to be realistic. I don't keep returning to South Africa and Zimbabwe and the neighbouring countries every year because I think that they're hopeless basket cases. Far from it. I return because I have faith in the ordinary people in these countries, and the fact that at the end of the day, pretty well everyone I meet on my travels and the time I spend living in Africa wants exactly the same thing for their families that people in Bathurst or Sydney or Brisbane want for their families, and that is a good education and safety and security and some bread on the table, and hopefully an appreciation of the greater community and the greater good. And I see that every day I'm in Africa, every single day.
Brilliant. And have you faced any criticism before about how you do approach this kind of writing in these topics?
Yeah, I think, look, the trick is balance. With so much of writing fiction, it's like anything, whether you're looking at research or history or politics or crime or whatever, is to get the balance right. I mean, this is a storybook. It's an escapist book. I saw one review recently where someone was saying, I don't think it's very realistic to have a psychad societies where they have firearms. Well, of course not. It's escapism. This is, and hopefully it's got a bit of humour in it. So it's a little bit different to some of my previous books, and it does have a bit of humour in there. So I think people should see it for what it is. And I'll tell you, in terms of feedback from my books, I'm continually humbled and amazed by the positive feedback I get. And to be honest, nothing gives me greater feedback than if I get one of my readers from one of the overseas countries that I'm writing about, from South Africa or Zimbabwe or Namibia, where I set the last book, who say, I can relate to what you're saying. That to me is the best thing someone can say to me. So yeah, I don't want to write a book that is all doom and gloom, because that's not my experience. If I wrote a book that was all doom and gloom, maybe people wouldn't want to read it. So yeah, I think a lot about writing, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, is trying to get that balance right without making it too bad or without whitewashing a situation, pretending that everything is hunky-dory, everything's fine when it's not. And that's a challenge for any writer, because you want to present enough real-life information to hopefully make the book interesting and relevant. You don't want to bore people either. You don't want to risk people turning off because you've just overloaded them with too much fact or opinion or too much of your own beliefs, whether you think everything is great or you think everything is rosy. So it's about getting that balance right, and that's a constant challenge. Yeah, it's a good question.
Absolutely. I think that authors of all kinds of fiction would have the same kind of challenges as well. So it's a very interesting point. So leading on from that, Tony, what level of research do you undertake when writing the books, and what are perhaps some of the tips that you would give people for researching their own stories?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I don't do much research to start off with. The way I write is I don't have a plot. Most authors, I think it's fair to say most, but not all. A lot of authors have everything mapped out in what's going to happen in their book, in the beginning, in the middle, and the end. And so that requires them to know what's going to happen and probably do a bit of research. I start with a premise or an idea, and this is an idea which we might talk about later about plants. You've touched on it before, a rare plant. It's worth so much money that people might, goodness, kill for it or something. And so I'll write a book about that. And now this is a book that talks about cycads, as you mentioned, of the Encephalatos family of cycads of South Africa, of which I knew absolutely nothing. I didn't even know what one looked like. It's funny though. You learn about something new. Now I see them everywhere. I see cycads everywhere now because they're big in Australia as well. So what you could do is fall into the trap. And if you're looking for tips, and if people are interested in writing, a risky thing to do is to start doing too much research too soon, I think, because I could go away and read several books on cycads and interview people that know about them and try and cram my own head full of information about these plants, which I knew nothing about, and then go off and try and write a story. That, in my view, is a mistake, because I've done that in the past. I've made that mistake when writing a book that was partially set during the Second World War. I loved researching the period. It was a book set in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, during the Second World War on a pilot training base. And I did so much research. I learned everything I could about what was happening in the war in Africa at that time, and I crammed all those facts and figures into my book. And you know what? Probably about 80% of it got cut by my editor and my publisher. You had too much information. So what I did was I learned about the illegal trade in cycads, and I started writing my book. And I knew that as I went on, I would need information. So I did what I have been doing in most of my books since those early days, is when I'm writing, the most important thing to me is the story. It's the pace of the story. It's keeping the momentum going, because these are thrillers, there's a bit of action, adventure, a bit of romance, but the story is the most important thing. So keep that going. If I don't know something about a particular plant or its value or even what it looks like, I just write a little note to myself in the manuscript saying check. And then later on, when I've finished writing the book and done my first edit, I go back. And then I see all those little notes where I need to find information. And then I go looking for that information. And the way I research is not by reading lots of books, and certainly not by using the internet. It's by finding some experts. And I was very, very fortunate to be helped by a number of people in South Africa who are experts in the field of cycads and experts in the underground trade in cycads. Even people in America. There was a guy called Ken McLeod in America who was an undercover investigator who took part in a major international operation to bring down a cycad smuggling ring. And he, like all the others, very generously gave of their time. And then later they did the best thing I could hope, and that was they read the manuscript and checked it for me. So I do my research to sort of get to the point of your question. I do my research in reverse. I do it later. And one of the reasons I do it later is because I don't waste the time of my experts. I don't say to my friend Michelle in South Africa, who's a botanist, tell me everything you know about cycads. That would be a waste of her time and a waste of my time. But if I say to her, what's the value of an Encephalatos hirsutus or something like that? What does the cortex of the Encephalatos hirsutus look like? Then we're pinning it down to what I need to know for the book.
Yeah, fantastic. I can see exactly how that would work in terms of not wasting someone else's time and getting that specific information that you need. Brilliant. So obviously we've mentioned that in Last Survivor, the story centres around the theft of this very rare African plant. So what is the inspiration for this story, and how did you learn about this plant?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Yeah, and look, the ideas for stories can come from anywhere. They can come from articles I've read in a newspaper, or more often than not, fireside chats with people around the campfire in Africa. I've got a couple of good stories that way. I've heard on the radio, or just a little anecdote that someone's told me. So I have a friend I won't say where she is exactly, but I was walking through her garden, and she had moved house, and she forcibly moved house, and brought all these plants with her. And luckily, this was a major logistical undertaking. So some of these cycads are huge. And I said, "What are they?" She said, "Well, I kind of knew they were cycads because I knew she was crazy about cycads." And my question was, "Why have you gone to all this effort?" And she said, "Because they're worth a lot of money." And she was telling me about the value of cycads, and then she mentioned there's an illegal market. She certainly was not involved in that, but she was telling me about this darker side, or the underbelly of the plant world, where you have these people around the world in countries like Australia and America and parts of the Middle East and some Asian countries, though it's by no means related to any particular group of people. They're just people who are crazy about plants, and crazy might be the wrong word, dedicated collectors of cycads who will pay incredible amounts of money for the rarer plants, and the rarest plants are in South Africa. And then she mentioned to me, oh, there was an international FBI operation to bring down a plant smuggling operation a few years. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe this. It happened in Africa, and this guy from the States who helped me with the research, Ken McLeod, went undercover pretending to be a cycad enthusiast and conducted an undercover operation over several countries over several years, and brought down an international cycad smuggling ring, which led to a number of arrests. And the thing with cycads is, well, the interesting thing about cycads that I then knew is that the most endangered living organism in the world today, most threatened and endangered living organism in the world today, is in certain members of the Encephalatos family of cycads. It's not rhinos, not elephants, not pangolins, not anything else that I've written about in some of these previous books. The plants are critically endangered, and they have just about disappeared from the wild, which is where they belong. So the dodgy salespeople, middle people, dig them out, send people out into the bush to dig them up. That then makes them even more endangered and more rare, which pushes up their value. And diehard collectors around the world will pay upwards of $1,000 for a seedling, or cycads are kind of measured on the length of their cortex, not to bore people, but that's the trunk or the stem of the plant, up to $1,000 per centimetre of height. So you can have a plant that may be only a metre tall, but it can be worth $100,000 on the illegal market. So there's serious money involved in this, and it's a seriously organised crime. So I thought, plants, what can you do with a valuable plant? What could it be used for? Underbelly meets Gardening Australia for the Aussies.
Yeah, amazing. Look, it's can be funny sometimes, the stories that you come across just by chance, and how you build them into your writing, Tony. It's very interesting. And plants, like, who doesn't love plants these days?
Yeah, and look, to be honest, Victoria, I kind of mixed it up a little bit with this book. It is a bit of fun, it's a little bit out there. There's a bunch of elderly plant fanciers who are heavily armed as well too. I didn't want to make light of the subject, but nor did I want to turn people off, because unless you're very interested in cycads and rare plants, you might think, well, you know what, I'd rather read a book about rhinos, to be quite honest, if I'm going to read a book about Africa. So I wanted to jazz this one up a little bit and push the envelope. So some of my readers should expect that. And this is a serious subject, but it's meant to be hopefully served up in a way that I hope is going to be entertaining as well.
Yeah, and for sure, I can already see that in the parts that I've read. I can sense the humor, and it's great. The characters already fantastic. And your main character, or one of the main characters, is in this book, Sonia. She's a very strong character, a strong woman. And I guess my question is, are there people like her in your life that you've written into your stories, or who have inspired these characters?
My wife. I shouldn't say that. She hopefully can't hear me. Yeah, look, I don't know. It's I have liked in the past reading books that have a strong female lead character in them, and so I write the sort of things, like that I like reading. But the characters, none of the characters in my books are based on real people, but they are sometimes amalgams of people I know, or they certainly have the same life experiences of people that I know. Now, Sonia has appeared in 3 of my previous books, and she proved to be quite popular. She's a very forceful character. She is like a force of nature on her own. She's a former mercenary, and she has a certain way about it. She's a lot of fun to write because I feel like she can be as out there as she wants to be, and no one will question it. I think if she was a male character, people would say, "Oh, she's like too much of a Rambo or too much of a Terminator or a Schwarzenegger." But because she is this kind of strong-willed woman, single mother, she has terrible problems with relationships and things as well, but she kind of counters that by being this sort of unstoppable force. So she's a lot of fun to write. The interesting thing about this book, as I said before, I don't have a plot when I start. I just had a premise, and the premise for this story was a very rare plant goes missing. Sonia was not supposed to be in this book. She pushed her way into this story with AK-47 Heckler & Koch machine pistol in hand. She kicked her way into this story as I was writing it. She just seemed to fit it because Sonia is no spring chicken. She's not getting any younger. And she seemed like a good fit for this bunch of, shall we say, slightly mature gardening fanciers. I felt like they needed somebody to lead them into battle. And so she pushed her way into the book, which was fun because I didn't expect it. So it was a good result. And I don't know, I must say, like I don't know what people like. I don't write books to order or just to satisfy people, but I've had a lot of good feedback about it. So she's probably here to stay.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, very forceful, but very good to read, very interesting. But I guess that leads me to my next question. Are the books you write the kind of – oh, sorry, I'm skipping one. Are the books you write, are they aimed more at men or more at women?
Yeah, I think the risk is, and sometimes the covers play a part in this, is you could look at these books and say, oh, that's a boy book, And sometimes, they're deliberately pitched, say, at the Father's Day market or whatever. But the interesting thing that I've found I didn't know this when I started writing. When I started writing, I thought my audience is probably going to be people like me, guys, middle-aged guys, maybe teenage boys. But I was pleasantly surprised to find over the years that the majority of my readers are women. I don't know by what percentage or whatever, because I've got plenty of male readers as well. But I think that's great because I think the risk is if you think, oh, I'm writing a shoot 'em up adventure for boys, then I'll slant them that way. I just write the sort of books that I like to read. But I get a lot of good feedback from the women who read my book, and it's interesting because before the book goes to print, the first person that reads it is my wife. I've got my mum, my mother-in-law, a couple of friends, my publisher, my editor, my proofreader are all women. So unless I've got a research expert who happens to be a guy who reads the manuscript, quite often the first man who reads this book is the first man who buys a copy. So I get a lot of good feedback along the process. So if Sonia does something out of character, someone will pick it up pretty quick.
Yeah. I bet they would with that kind of those kind of critics and audience around you. So the books that you write, they are the kind of books that you yourself do read?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the mistakes people can make if they're into writing, if they want to write, I think, and it's a mistake I made with a manuscript. My first manuscript that was never published was I wrote a book that was set in Australia, set in the outback, and the reason I set it in the outback was because I thought people overseas, like in America or in Europe, want to read a book set. I've never been to the outback, and then so I thought that I'll write it because I think someone else will like it. That's a terrible mistake to make, And if I ever revisit that book, there'll be a lot of rewriting going on in that book because I have been to the outback. I think it's a mistake to say I'll write a book in a particular genre or a particular location because that's what the audience wants. I'll write a vampire book because there's lots of vampire books being sold, or I'll write a Harry Potter book because that'll make me rich. That's the biggest mistake you can make. So I think there's a good adage in writing that says read a lot, write a lot. These are old adages are good because they make sense. And so I try to read as much as I can. But, I wouldn't and couldn't write a book that I didn't want to read. And so, I like reading thrillers. I like a bit of action adventure. I like books set in Africa if I can find them. I'm lucky. There's not too many other people writing thrillers set in the game parks and the national parks of Africa, which is good. If there were, I would read them, but I'm lucky there's not many. So I think it's a good guideline for writers to write, because if you're writing something that you wouldn't normally read, you're probably not going to get anywhere with it.
That's a very good point, and a good tip for people who are looking to do their own kind of writing as well, I think. So something that I have noticed looking at the past books you've written and including this one is that there is an overarching theme of poaching and the effects and the consequences that this crime can have. And we see that theme in your books. So are the consequences of poaching something you've seen firsthand? Is that something you've witnessed?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very, very much so. My wife and I bought a house in South Africa about 7 years ago on the edge of the Kruger National Park. And before then, we'd been travelling throughout Southern Africa in particular and East Africa up into Rwanda and Kenya. And unfortunately, the more you travel, you very quickly learn about the threat to wildlife. So we have seen the very sad effects of poaching. Dead animals, terrible injuries to animals. Sometimes it's something as simple as a wire snare that's ostensibly set to catch a buck, like an impala or a kudu or an antelope, ostensibly for food. But you get lions and leopards and painted dogs, predators who are very curious by their nature. They get caught in snares and they can die a terrible death that way. So it's not all big game, people shooting rhinos or killing lions and things like that. But you do see that as well. And we see recently, there's been incidents of numbers of elephants dying as well. I won't say whether the Botswana ones are related to poaching, but certainly there have been mass poisonings of elephants in the past. So it can be crime on an almost industrial scale, and it can be very, very disheartening. And near where we live, in the Kruger Park, is the largest remaining population of rhinos, and rhinos are killed for their horns, which are used not so much in traditional medicine as people once believed, but more as something almost worse, as a status symbol in some of the user countries where rhino horn is used. So it can be very disheartening, but as I said earlier, what I do like to point out is the good work that's being done. I mean, there is a fantastic amount of work being done in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and the other countries I write about to fight poaching. The war against poaching is being fought, and certainly many more poaching incursions into these national parks have foiled than actually get through to success, and that's something you don't hear about a lot. So there is this ongoing battle to protect and conserve wildlife and even plants. There have been armed operations to prevent or go after poachers who have been taking things like cycads and there are other endangered plants. And what I often like to point out to people is being we have these issues in Australia, of course, as well too, with species under threat. And sometimes it's not poaching, it's things like habitat destruction, which is very much a cause of wildlife extinctions or endangerment here in Australia. One thing I do like to say is to put it in perspective in the countries I write about, if you're a greenie or if you're conservation minded in Australia, you might write a letter to your politicians or raise some money. In the countries where I spend a lot of time and write about, you may take up a gun and go into the bush and literally put your life on the line to protect endangered species. That's what the stakes are like when it comes to the war on poaching in Africa. It can be a life or death, a matter of life and death. And so, so what I do in the books is I think it reflects my personal journey, is that when I first went to South Africa in 1995, I don't think I had ever thought about the natural environment or wildlife at all. It was just, I grew up in the suburbs and lived in the city. It wasn't something that I had any need to know about or care about. So my own level of knowledge has increased, hopefully, over the last 20 years, and my passion for it has certainly increased exponentially. So if I can help raise awareness of some of these issues, that's what I want to do. And even though this is a fun, at times funny book, it's a very serious issue. Plants are as important in the natural ecosystem as any big animal is. And if we say it's okay to dig up all the plants and sell them, what's next? Where do we stop? So look, I try, Victoria. It's all about balance, like we were saying before. I don't want to use the books as my personal soapbox and push my views down people's throats. But if I can help raise awareness, but more importantly, I think, to get back to our last question you asked, I'm writing about stuff I'm interested in, and hopefully other people will be interested in it. And if they're not, they can buy some other book. So.
Yeah, look, and absolutely. I've just finished reading the previous Sonia Kurt's book, The Cull, and something that it highlighted to me, who doesn't, like you said, hasn't got a high knowledge of poaching and the effects and what it looks like in Africa itself. So something that I found interesting in reading The Cull was Sonia's efforts to lead the leopards and that anti-poaching force, and to know that they existed was good. It was great to be able to learn that information.
Yeah, and that's based on a real-life anti-poaching unit called the Black Mambas, who are the first all-female anti-poaching unit in Africa. There's another one in Zimbabwe called the Akashingas now, but the Black Mambas, on whom the fictitious leopards were based, they do an incredible job, because this all-female anti-poaching unit not only patrols the bush and putting themselves at some risk, I might say, from lions and leopards and let alone poachers, and charging buffaloes and elephants, but they also do a fantastic job within their own local communities. And this is an important part of the fight against poaching. Is it's not just guns and bullets, it's not just boots on the ground. It's about education. It's about educating people in what are quite disadvantaged communities sometimes on the edge of national parks in Africa, that wildlife should and has a value to them, that it can create jobs through tourism. This is why it's so important for tourism to restart in Africa now, because, people are doing it really tough in the countries that I write about. And the tourism is often, in particular where I live, is just about the only source of income, about the only source of employment. And if that goes, people starve, and that can have terrible ramifications for wildlife and crime as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very important work. And like you said, as with many other things, it can start with the education too in the local communities. So, fantastic. And Tony, you've worn many hats and you've had many jobs, as we spoke about when we're introducing you for tonight's event. And yet you've always wanted to write a novel. So what planted that seed for you, and where did this interest come from?
My mum, who's probably watching from the central west of New South Wales at the moment, in New Gowra, thanks to Mum, for getting me reading at a very early age. Look, I don't have kids, but I've got a brother who lives at New Gowra who has lots of kids and grandkids. And I think the greatest gift that any parent or grandparent can give to a kid is reading, is a love of books. And my mum certainly instilled that in me from a very, very early age. And it was such a big part of my life that I used to read all these books and spend time in the local library after school. And you know, gifted and talented child that I was, I would look around the library and say, someone must write all these books. So people would say, what do you want to do when you grow up, Tony? And I would say, I want to write a book. And they'd say, well, good, why don't you become a plumber or an electrician or something like that? and as it happened, I was absolutely no good with my hands, and I'm still not, and absolutely no good at things like maths and science. I worked that out pretty much as soon as I started going to school. So the only thing that I was remotely able to do was English, and I liked writing. And so, you know, from the time I was a very little boy, the only thing in life I wanted to do was write a book. And I think for anybody who has a dream, at whatever stage of life you're at, if you're like me, there'll always be plenty of people, sometimes friends, who will say, you can't do that. You know, don't be silly. Don't be silly. Don't leave. I left my job in 1996, a very good job, I hasten to add, with the support of my wife. I couldn't have done it without her. But a lot of my friends, my boss said, you're crazy. You know, don't do it. But I think if you have something inside you and it's burning away or smouldering away inside you and it's what you want to do, you should at least do your very best to give yourself at least a chance to do it. And that's what I wanted to do always, all my life. That's all I wanted to do.
There you go. And how has the current situation in the world, the current pandemic, how has it affected you as a writer? Are you more disciplined, or are you more distracted, or what can you tell us about that?
Victoria, I have been in Sydney in our version of lockdown for the last 3 months. I'm 55 and I have never been as fit or in shape or run as much as I have in my entire life, because I'm quietly going crazy. So the fortunate thing for us, of course, here in Australia, for the South Africans, was the South African lockdown was very, very strict. People weren't even allowed to exercise for some time. We were allowed to exercise, and so I've been doing too much exercise, I think. I'm often asked, does Africa inspire you? And we touched on it. And yes, it does. And my answer to that question is, what works for me is being in the countries that I write about. So when I wrote The Cull that you mentioned, which goes from South Africa through Zimbabwe all the way to Tanzania, that's because I was with some friends driving from South Africa through Zimbabwe all the way up to Tanzania. So I very much get my inspiration from where I happen to be. So I'm writing a book at the moment for next year, and it's hard. I won't lie. There's no easy way to say it. So what I'm doing is kind of falling back on my own advice, is if I need help, I go to people, I go to experts. So I've been talking to a lot of my friends in South Africa and just picking their brains and asking them what they're up to and hoping they'll give me some inspiration and some words to help keep me going until I can go to Africa. So yeah, look, I've been working as hard as I can, Victoria, but it hasn't been easy, and I'm missing my other home at the moment. But in that respect, I'm like many people all over the world, so I can't claim I'm any worse off. But I'm lucky that I have a good publisher, and I'm lucky that I have a wonderful, family and support network, and my wife, and I'm working, and I'm lucky I have a job, to be quite honest, and I don't discount that for a minute. So I hope people go and buy the books, because if you don't buy the books, I won't have a job and I'll have to go and job keep it. So.
And on that note, for anyone tuning in from Bathurst, our local bookseller, Books Plus, does have copies of the book, so you can pick one up for The Last Survivor, should you wish to. And I'm sure Orange would have that at their local bookseller as well. And anyone else who's tuned in, it was out this week, so check in with your booksellers. And Tony, some writers supplement their income by teaching writing. Is this something you're interested in?
I've done a bit in the past, but interestingly enough, for anyone who's looking to sort of escape post-COVID, my wife and I recently furthered our addiction to Africa by investing in a safari lodge in Zimbabwe, a place called Nantwich in Wangi National Park. And I've been talking to another Aussie author, Fleur McDonald, who's a fantastic author. You've probably heard of Fleur. And she and I are talking about running a writer's retreat over in Africa sometime next year. So if everyone wants something to look forward to, we're looking at going over there and seeing if a few of our readers and aspiring writers would like to come over. And she's actually going to get her publisher to come along as well. So there'll be information about that on my Facebook page at Tony Park Author and at my website, tonypark.net, if anyone is interested. Sorry, shameless plug there. But it is, it's something I'd like to do, and I'd like to do it in an exotic location, mainly because I want to go to an exotic location right now.
Well, look, it sounds fantastic, and Fleur is another very, very well-known and popular author among library users. So, look, fantastic. That sounds fantastic.
Come to Africa with Fleur.
Yes, let's all go.
That's right. Sorry.
Goodness. So I guess, Tony, what's next for your characters? You say you're writing a book. Is it going to be another Sonia story, or is it going to be something else?
So far, with some effort, I have managed to keep Sonia out of this next book. It's not to say she won't. It's an interesting question, and it goes back to what we're talking about. I do get inspiration from what's around me. So the book I'm writing for next year is partly set now during the lockdown, but set during the lockdown in South Africa. Because, as I've mentioned, there are signs now that it is not a good thing for wildlife and for the national parks. Because, interestingly enough, and this happens where we have our lodge in Zimbabwe, is one of the greatest deterrents to poaching is tourism. So the presence of safari guides and vehicles and people continuously in the national parks is actually a good thing, because it kind of makes parts of these national parks no-go zones to poachers. But with the tourists absent, and the normal tourist traffic absent, there's been some early signs that this has not been a good thing for the problem with poaching. So I'm looking at a book on that. And it's also a book that has also kind of reflected more of my journey and increasing awareness. It's a book about traditional beliefs in African culture and the part that they play in day-to-day life, and even in the fight against poaching, where there are traditional healers in South Africa and many other countries who will actually market various treatments to people, to poachers, to criminals, to protect them when they go out into the bush from being shot, or will make them disappear if the rangers are tracking them. And it's not just poachers that have these belief systems. It's also people involved in the security forces and in high risk jobs. And it's been really interesting to delve into the background of these traditional belief systems. I'm finding it fascinating.
Stay tuned. All right. Well, that's it for all the questions I had for you, Tony. So we've got a few that have come through from the audience.
Right.
So what have we got? Nigel, what do you see as the biggest change culturally and generally in Africa from your first visit to current times? Good question.
Yeah, excellent question, Nigel. I think, like Australia, the countries that I write about, South Africa and Zimbabwe, are becoming increasingly urbanised, and that brings problems, I think. I think there are good things. People will say, "Oh, it's all got worse and it's bad and everything like that." There have been some fantastic signs of progress in South Africa. In the 25 years I've been going, there have been new national parks designated, proclaimed in the country. The problem of rhino poaching got worse, but now people are getting on top of it. And one of the biggest changes culturally I've seen, Nigel, is that when I first visited South Africa in 1995 as a tourist, one of the first things I noticed is when I went into places like the Kruger Park is that the visitors to the park were overwhelmingly white people. It was something that, and even in the earlier times of the apartheid era, African people, local people had been banned from the park. And that situation is completely different today, whereas South Africa's national parks are very well patronised by people from all parts of society and all cultures. And I think there is good work being done in making their parks truly equitable to everyone and giving newer generations of South Africans of all backgrounds, a love of nature and a love of national parks. And so now today it is absolutely 100% normal to see a Zulu family or a Xhosa family or a Shangaan family, mum and dad and 2 kids going into the national park, which is great. And it wasn't happening 25 years ago.
There you go. And that's really good to see, isn't it? People embracing their local culture and everything you've said. Yeah, fantastic. We've got a comment here from Patsy. I have been to Africa once in 2006. I went to South Africa, Durban on the East Coast. I was amazed at the similarity of landscape with Australia. Racial tensions shocked me, so visible, black and white ghettos, barbed wires, fear and anger. But I met beautiful people, black and white, with amazing stories to tell that gave a sense of hope. The difficult past of South Africa is never far, though.
Yeah, good comments, Patsy. Yeah, I think, history plays a part, well, wherever you are. We're same here, same in the US. We have to be mindful of it. But as I said, I fall back on and draw hope from the fact that, like I said before, all of my friends, whether they're white Afrikaans-speaking people or they're Xisonga-speaking people or Zulu-speaking people, all the people I know want exactly the same thing as you and me, and that is, a home, a future for their families and for their kids, and for bread on the table and a job. And we're going to have to work even harder moving forward to make sure that all those things happen there, just as we have to work hard to ensure that we can return to a level of prosperity here in Australia. And I see no shortage of the indomitable human spirit, which is something I'll try and get across in my book. So, yeah, great comment, Patsy.
All right, wonderful. We have another question here. I think it might be from Sandy. Because you like to write on location where you are, do you know when you will add Ethiopia into one of your books?
That's a very good question. I haven't been to Ethiopia, but a couple of my friends have, and they rave about it. They absolutely rave about it. So it is somewhere that I haven't been, and I don't know when I'll get there, but I suspect I will get there eventually because it has incredibly rich cultural diversity and some amazing wildlife of its own. I have a friend who's a hotelier in South Africa, and he just loves it. He keeps going back there. So, yeah, one of the things that I like, Sandy, is the fact that although I've travelled a lot in the continent, I've barely scratched the surface. So writing books is a good excuse for me to get to somewhere different. So I will very, very likely get there one day.
Great. Another one from Patsy. Underbelly meets gardening Australia. Loves it. What would cost to do? Very good question.
I don't know, getting Costa with an assault rifle. I don't know.
All right. So if you have any more questions for Tony, please send them through so he can answer them for you. We'll give it a few more minutes, Tony, to see if anyone comes up with some more questions. I guess another one from me is do you see any of your characters going international outside?
Sorry, is that outside of Africa that you were saying there, Victoria?
Yeah, sorry, I think I broke up for a second there.
Yeah, yes, I would go outside of Africa.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, quite possibly. I had some scenes set in Australia in a previous book. They got cut, mainly because of the length of the book. But what I'm interested in is, how Paul Hogan as Crocodile Dundee goes to New York and he's completely out of his depth. I quite like the idea of some real full-on safari guide, ending up in somewhere like Sydney and thinking what they think of the place and stuff. Some real bushy sort of coming to the big smoke.
That would certainly provide a little bit of humour, wouldn't it? All right. So we have another question from Nigel. Please tell us a little of the Painted Dog Conservation Project that you are a patron of going in these difficult times. Paint dog are very much vulnerable to urbanisation or rural expansion.
Yeah, very much so. It's a good question, Nigel. So I'm a supporter, a patron of Painted Dog Conservation Incorporated, which is a charity based in Perth, run by a couple of people called John and Angela Lemon. And they do a fantastic job, this husband and wife raising money to support in situ conservation projects in South Africa. And in situ means these are projects that are already going. And I think one of the strengths of their organisation is that they don't go into the continent, into the countries where they work, saying, this is what we're going to do. They support viable conservation projects. And so you talk about things like urbanization, and I was mentioning habitat destruction in the past. The painted dog, or also known as the African wild dog, is not able to interbreed with domestic dogs, so it doesn't face a threat like that. But it's very, very susceptible to dog illnesses, things like rabies and distemper and those things. And like our poor old pets as well too. One of the biggest problems they face is simply being run over by cars, because they're animals that range over a huge area. So some of the things that painted dog conservation has done in the past is darting and vaccinating dogs, something as simple as giving them the same vaccinations that your friendly home pooch would get. Put a special collar on the dogs, which can be for radio tracking, but they're also collars that are quite broad and have reflective on them so that they'll show up in cars' headlights. Avoid run over. Snare can actually protect it from the snare. The other thing that they do, which is good, is that this can't be done with all animals, but because painted dogs are intelligent and very kind of nurturing, is you can have some success in reintroducing dogs into the wild if they've, say, suffered an injury or something. And painted dog conservation will take the and be able to, and also, I think it was asking about what I've seen change in the last 25 years. When I first started visiting Southern Africa in 1995, there was thought to be about 2,500 painted dogs left. The entire had been as regarded as feral animals and being deliberately hunted to almost extinction. But their numbers are up around 6,500 these days. So there's been some great successes in conserving and protecting that species, which is important to note.
Yeah, absolutely. Going from 200 up to that many, that's fantastic work, isn't it? All right. So I think we may be done with the questions, Tony. What is your favourite African animal? I sound like a toddler.
I do like painted dogs, but it would be a close second, or possibly edging it out, would be the leopard. I love leopards. They're my favourite of the big five of the big cats. I like leopards because when you see one and they're hard to see, they always look guilty. They look like they've been caught in the act. So they have great character to them. So, and I love rhinos. And hey, I love plants now. I've become a convert to plants. I like cycads. Yeah.
Fantastic. And look, we've got another question from Karen. Hi, Tony. I had a few visits to South Africa, Kenya and Zimbabwe in 94 and 95 for work. Yes, lucky you, Karen. And it does get under your skin. One thing that I didn't see was the Great Migration in Kenya. Have you seen this?
I have, yeah. When I was writing The Cull, the book that you mentioned, Victoria, earlier on, my wife and I travelled up to Tanzania, and we saw, the migration goes from Kenya to Tanzania and from the Masai Mara to the Serengeti Game Reserve. We were in the Serengeti Game Reserve, and we happened to be in the right place to see the great wildebeest and zebra migration across the Mara River. And I wrote about it in The Cull. I think I wrote about it probably within about an hour of witnessing it. I remember sitting in the Land Rover and just typing. I had my laptop with me because I wanted to capture it. It was one of the most moving, incredible things I had seen, this concentrated, massive wildlife. I think we tried to work out that perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 wildebeest and zebras crossed this stretch of river in the space of about 45 minutes. And quite often when you see it, one of the unfortunate things you see is these enormous crocodiles that kill quite a lot of them. And not a single one of these animals were lost. And it was this incredible force of nature. And at the end of it, I think I just wanted to, I don't know whether I wanted to burst into tears or just get up and applaud. It was just this amazing spectacle. So Karen, go back if you get the chance I'll go back as well too. So yeah, it is a great experience. But it's not all about seeing thousands of animals and quantities and stuff. It is a great spectacle, but I can be just as happy watching the monkeys around my house, which is what I'm doing at the moment. I've got remote security cameras at my house in South Africa, so I get a lot of joy from just watching the monkeys going about their daily business.
That's amazing. Fantastic. And it's on the bucket list for sure.
Good.
Definitely on the bucket list. All right. Well, look, Tony, I'd like to thank you again for joining us tonight. Copies of Last Survivor, like I said earlier a few minutes ago, they're available at the Bathurst local bookseller Books Plus shop. They will be available in a month or so overseas, Tony, you said. But if you're in Australia and you're tuning in, go out and grab your copy, because I've started reading and I've flipped through it and I've just, I want to know more about this cycad and what happens to this species. So thank you again.
Thank you, Victoria, and thanks very much to Bathurst Library, and thanks to everybody who's joined us wherever you are. And I really love that we can stay connected at this time. Thank you all so much.